And I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined us. We're so happy that you're here. I'm Rabbi Miriam Jairus, and I want to thank John Levine for making the initial contact to Rabbi Maas to do this program and then to expand it to the world so that we can all enjoy and appreciate. Over 15 years ago, Carrie Shaw, who is our most recent Sherwin T. Wine Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, came up with this idea that we should honor people who are important to us so that others can know through the people that we honor what our philosophy is all about. And the first person was Albert Einstein. So Professor Malkin is in very good company. You'll hear much about Yaakov Malkin from his daughter, from Sivan. But I just wanted to say that when I first met him, it was at a colloquium in Detroit, Michigan. And we were talking about whether secular Jews or atheists were traditional. And I can't ever say it the way he did, but he said, we are very traditional. He said, in my case, I am a third generation atheist. And I always appreciated his wit and his intellect and absolutely his commitment and dedication to secular humanistic Judaism and creating what we have today. I know that Malkin was the provost of Tmura for many years, and when Rabbi Wein died, he became the provost for the entire International Institute. And Sivan and I are recipients of their hard work because both of us were ordained through the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. And I always give homage to the work that he did. There's no better person, of course, to give us insight into Yaakov Malkin than his daughter. And Rabbi Maas is the current dean of Tmura, the rabbinic seminary in Israel. They have just ordained, I believe, 6 new rabbis, and we're approaching almost 40, I believe, altogether. And everybody always
50.
Almost, see, I'm 10 behind, almost 50. And people always say, well, how come they can ordain so many rabbis in Israel? And, you know, we have a lesser number, but we're good in our strength, that's for sure. But I always said, well, in Israel, they have one advantage over us. They grow up, most of them, speaking Hebrew, and they know it. So for us, sometimes the Hebrew language is a bit of a deterrent, but we also have wonderful candidates coming up. I'm really honored to introduce Rabbi Sivan Malkin Maas to you. I'll ask you to put your questions in the chat. Rabbi Maas will speak for a while and then we'll open it to questions and I'll make myself available to share your questions. So without further ado, Sivan, the spotlight is for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited, and I was trying to think, how can I tell you about Yaakov? First of all, he has an internet site, which you can all look through. All his, not all, but many of his books are up there, and you can read them for free. Some of them are in Hebrew, some of them are in English, some of them are in both. A few are in French, 1 or 2 are in Russian. So basically you can read and see his books. I think one of the things that is interesting about Yaakov is that not only was he a prolific writer, but he was a doer. Maybe that's something that is common to many people from his generation as new immigrants to Israel before Israel was a state. He came to Israel in 1934, and that was many years before Israel was a state. He was 7 years old when he got here. And I think the idea was that people at that time sort of looked around at reality and said, okay, this is the reality. This is not what we would like it to be. So what do we do about it? And I think that this is something which was very characteristic of him all through his life. He died at the age of 92. And until then, he did many, many things. And basically today, I chose just two aspects to show you today. One is what he thought about Jewish culture altogether, but how it relates to community. And what he thought when he was thinking Jewish community in Israel, and then not only Jewish. And then I wanted to focus of one I think of as interesting innovations, is philosophical innovations, and maybe tell you a little bit about family in the end. So I'm going to try and share. Miriam, I think I need you to enable me to share screen. At this point, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I can't unless you allow me to share.
I believe you can now.
Let me try. Yep, I can. Okay, so as we go along through some of the slides, you're going to see in the background some paintings, and I will talk about them as we progress. This is Tel Aviv in 1936. I was looking for a picture from 1934, but I don't have one. This is the one I found, and he tells the story, or he told the story, that when he was 7 years old, he came with his parents from Poland to Jaffa by boat. And when they got to the Jaffa port, one of these fishing boats came to take them from the boat to the port. And possibly this is the kind of fishing boat that took him. As he got on the boat, one of the fishermen saw this 7-year-old boy who was, as he tells the story, was cold and frightened. And he wanted to give him something to eat. And he showed him a little thing that looked to my father like a sweet prune, and he gave it to my father, and my father took a bite, and it was an olive. You can imagine the disappointment. It wasn't a Polish sweet prune, it was a Jaffa olive. So this is one of his first memories from Tel Aviv. And he ended up living not very far from Jaffa in Tel Aviv for many, many years. This was his hometown. But in the late 1950s, and I'm jumping many years ahead, he wrote an article during the time that he was the artistic director of the Habima Theater in Tel Aviv. He wrote an article about the new community center in Israel. You have to understand, there was none. There wasn't a community center in Israel. But he wrote something like this utopia of the new community center in Israel, which he explained was really a substitute for the synagogue. And the mayor of Haifa read that article and called him up and said, why don't you leave Tel Aviv and come here to Haifa? This is the house that I will give you to build the community center. And above, as you can see, is a house which was built as a hotel in the late 1800s and given eventually to the municipality of Haifa by the Rothschild family. And Yaakov, my father, decided that this is what he should do. And eventually the family, I wasn't born yet, the family moved to Haifa to start building the community center. He has a book. By the way, everything that he did in life eventually culminated in a retrospective in a book about what he did. And one of those books is this one, Quality of Life and the Renaissance of the Community. This is a book that was written it came out in the late 70s. And what he does there is really the story of how they started the community center, what was their vision. And for him, there was a connection between the philosophical vision of what a community should be and the practice of how do you actually build it, both as an organization and as buildings. And so he started with this small building that I was telling you about, which they renovated. But this is very much the view of my childhood. I spent here many, many hours in this beautiful building and the gardens surrounding it. And in it, he built an art gallery. This is the main entrance to the old building. These are the gardens around, and this is the area. The area, as you can see, there is an old photo on the top and a more modern photo, even though that one is pretty old also, of what is called Mount Carmel in Haifa. So this is the area. And he believed that not only do we need to create this community center, but this should be a meeting place for Jews from all around the world who will come to enjoy Jewish Israeli culture as it evolves. And he had this dream of this campus in which there will be a hotel and and dormitories for students and a big auditorium and a park and et cetera, et cetera. And he, as usual, wrote an article and went to a friend of his who was an architect by the name of Mansfeld, the same architect who eventually designed the Israeli Museum and many, many other famous buildings, and said to him, let's design this campus. And Mansfeld said, you know, and where will the money come? And Yaakov said, I have no idea. But if we don't have a design and we don't have a plan, then we won't have the money for it. And Al Mansfeld actually sat down to draw the plans. And eventually the campus was built. This is the center. It is quite big. It does have a big auditorium. The hotel was never built, neither were the dormitories. But I think that I will try to explain with it what his idea for a new Jewish community center or a new synagogue should be. So a new synagogue, like the old synagogues, should have music, should have performances, should have kids having a good time, and should have parents at the same time enjoying themselves, doing other things. And this is a place to get together, and the content doesn't have to be a synagogue ritual. It can be actually culture, and culture in itself is a kind of a ritual in his eyes. You have to understand that they also had lectures. I will stop the share for a moment. They also had lectures that went on during the weekend. It was never closed. The community center was never closed. On Friday night, I'll tell you about what they did on Friday night, but on Saturday morning, they had a Shacharit Shabbat, early morning lectures. And in those lectures, I remember very well my father giving lectures. My grandfather used to give lectures as well. I was a small kid at the time. I don't remember much of the content, but I do remember in their lectures, as Miriam said in the beginning, that they had a good sense of humor. And from time to time, you would hear this roaring laughter, this wave of laughter going through the audience. I remember that very well as a small child. And eventually I remember my father, once when I asked him, why did you become a presenter, somebody who likes to lecture? And he said, because I remember listening to my grandfather my father giving lectures and having the audience laugh. And I always wanted my audience, an audience to laugh at smart things that I said. And he eventually really did that. But that is an actual memory. So we'll go back to the screen so I can show you some more things. My father, who loved culture and loved film, had a very good friend, really a couple that lived in Haifa, the Van Leers, Leah and Wim Van Leer. Wim Van Leer came from Holland, and Leah came from Romania, and they were very, very close friends of my family. And Leah had started the Israeli film archive in her home, which was a few homes down from where we lived. And she started showing at Friday night movies at her home. And my father then came to her and suggested, why don't we show these movies at the Rothschild Center, at the community center that he began? And that's how they started. It was called the Good Movie Club. That's how it started. And eventually it was called the Cinematheque, when they put together the programs for this big auditorium, etc., this building that you see in front of you that they ended up succeeding building. He decided to take the parking lot and to change the underground parking into a cinematheque, because they wouldn't allow him to do a cinematheque. But fact and reality never stood in the way of my father's plans. So they ended up starting the Haifa Cinematheque, which was really the first cinematheque in Israel. And up to today, there is the film festival that goes on in Haifa. Eventually, Leah moved to Jerusalem and started the Cinematheque in Jerusalem and the Cinematheque in Tel Aviv. All of them operate until today. And the Haifa festival is one of the big festivals that are going on in Israel, and very, very successful. This concept of the synagogue in the center of town, the cultural center, the Jewish center, which has all these cultural activities, had many lectures as well, not only on Saturdays, And it developed into a place which was both economically sustainable, but also culturally sustainable. And as you see, we already don't live in Haifa for many, many years, and it's still working and doing very well. The problem was that my father realized a few years after that he built it, that not everybody is coming to this place, even though it was very successful. And everybody meant, what he meant by everybody was that most Arabs that live in Haifa do not come to the community center. So he appealed to the Haifa ministry and said to them, we have to build another center where Jews and Arabs can meet and both will feel at home. The Arabs in Haifa were very suspicious. They thought that this was a government initiated program. And it took, I think, about 2 years for them, a group of Arabs and Jews, to convince the Arab community in Haifa that they actually mean business and that it is important for them to build a community center which will be run jointly with an Arab director and a Jewish director. And it took a while, and eventually they did build it, and it still exists. They have 2 locations, one across the street from the other. This is the other building. They have an Arab theater. They have an Arab library, one of the largest Arab libraries in Israel, which has a funny story in the background, which I'll tell you in a minute. It also has an art gallery. It has music festivals. It has theater festivals. It is the center for the holiday of holidays every year, which is this combination of the winter holidays around this time of year. I'll continue, and if you want the story of the Arab library, I'll tell you a bit later. As I mentioned, Yaakov was a prolific writer. These are just a few examples of his writings about Judaism as culture, secular Judaism, and I'll touch upon a few points about his philosophy. But I do want to mention something about Felice Malkin, my mother, who they got married, I think it was 1950. They got married in Haifa in the Dan Hotel. The ambassador of the US ambassador was at their wedding, and so were the rest of the guests, which were about 15 people. All in all, only my grandmother from America came. My grandfather refused to come. And they had this small wedding in Jerusalem. And they are, I mean, my father died 2 years ago, but up to then they were very much in love. And this is one of the creations that they did together. It's a philosophical book about this aesthetics and ethics, talking about art as love. And it is also a series of drawings that my mother did on the same topic. It is not, as she says, her drawings are not an illustration to my father's writing, but it is her creation, thinking about the topic and creating around that. And these are a few of my mother's drawings. Yaakov loved her art, was very, very proud of her art, and always wanted to show her art. So it was important for me that when I give this talk and talk about him, that I show some of Felice's art. And this gives me also an opportunity to remind you that there is a video, a recording of a meeting that we had, I think it was 1.5 years ago, in memory of my father. And you can see it. I'm sure Miriam can send you the link, and you can hear more about him and some of his talks that he gave in Detroit and in Federation talks around the world. This is another book, which is a book that relates to Shir HaShirim, to the Song of Songs from the Bible. This is a play that he wrote, which is also talked about and recorded in that meeting. So these are just, again, a few remindings of my mother's beautiful drawings. I won't tell you a lot about our family. If you want to ask questions, you can. As you know, kids of today do not like their photos to be out there on the network. And as this is recording, I cannot show photos of my family. But I did want to tell you that one of the things that characterized my father was the fact that even though we lived in Israel, a small provincial country, that's how he called it, it was very important for them, for both of my parents, that we travel around the world, that we get to understand dialogues between cultures, because as you know, Jewish culture has never developed in a vacuum, but also always in a dialogue with other cultures. And he also believed that we should aim high and that we should always look at masterpieces, and masterpieces you should see in the original. So if works of art are in Paris in the Louvre, or they are in the Met in New York, we have to get there because we have to see the originals, because if not, if you want to be a painter, how will you paint like Rembrandt? Or if you want to be an architect, how will you paint if you haven't seen and been in a Le Corbusier a building or whatever? So this was something that was very, very important for them. Besides, they always believed that meeting people and sharing with people our commitment to Judaism and Judaism as culture and the Jewish people will evolve into a fruitful dialogue for them and for us. And therefore, traveling was always very significant. I'm going to go back just for a moment, again, to spark questions that may come up. There was this is a meeting between Yaakov and Jackie Khoury, who is a journalist, who was asking my father about his days in those years that I quickly jumped between the Jaffa port and us in Haifa, of what my father did. And one of the things that Yaakov did was that he was a member of the Haganah, the underground in Israel before the state of Israel was established. And because when he was 16, he was injured and in a way crippled, he wasn't able to be physically a soldier. He then had the underground radio station. And this is him telling Jackie Khoury about it. And I also found an archive picture of the Israeli radio show, because after the Israel was established and everything became legal, he continued to be on the radio. It's hard to see him here. He's behind the glass. He's not the technician sitting in the front. And one of the radio shows that he was on every week was something which was called Bimot and Badim. And this was about theater his father and himself, Dovber Malkin and Yaakov Malkin, would appear once a week criticizing theater. And they did that for a long, long time. And the funny thing is that many, many years after, my eldest daughter married this young man who we found out was the son of an actor who got lots of criticism on his Yaakov's show. Thankfully, it was good criticism, but that's part of that biography as well. And one of the areas that Yaakov was interested in and was important for him to excel was to be a very good lecturer. And he taught rhetorics for many, many years. And we still do. We still teach rhetorics with his method in Tmura. One of his books that, by the way, I just suggested to the IISHJ students that I'm going to be teaching soon in the Israel course, is this book that recently came out in English. And this is a book that I think could be very interesting for you. Basically, it talks about the fact that secular Jewish culture follows the tradition of about 300 years of secular Jewish thought. It talks about its roots in the works of Maimonides and other thinkers, followed by Spinoza, and realizing how did they start, or how did the process of secularization base itself on these thoughts, or did they actually spark this process? This new system of thought in the modern era, what we call secular humanistic, is based on, as we all know, individual choice rather than on something which is prescribed to us by rabbinical sages and writers, et cetera, et cetera. It's not one of disbelief, he claims, but rather one of beliefs of a different kind. And we'll talk about his major, I think, and significant focus on secular humanistic belief in just a minute. What he wanted to show in this book, which is really an anthology of writers like Amos Oz and Rachel Elior and Aleph Bet Yoshua and Chaim Be'er and Chaim Cohen and Yehuda Bauer and Amos Funkenstein, et cetera, many, many Israeli famous, internationally writers who all focus their discussion on the origins and evolution of secular Jewish thought in the way that they think, and they don't always agree. They also have this understanding among them, whatever their politics are, and as I said, they don't always agree philosophically, they don't always agree politically, that the founding of the state of Israel in the mid-20th century constituted a turning point in the history of the Jewish people, and they try to explore what does it actually mean to secular people. So I think it's a very valuable book to read. It is focused on secular Jewish thought in Israel. The other book is, I think, also a very interesting and important book. It asks the question, is there this new Judaism without God? And it has another part to the book that talks about Bible as literature, Jewish culture and Bible as literature. But I would like to explore with you a little bit about what this book is trying to do. In the beginning of the book, he takes different thoughts and different terms, and he tries to define each term, thinking that when you define these basic concepts, this is a basis for dialogue, or this enables a dialogue. In other words, when I say Jewish history, what do I mean? When I say a Jew, what do I mean? When I say humanistic atheism in Judaism, what do I actually mean? So the first part of the book is about our language. The second part of the book is talking about Bible as literature. I think this book we produced in 2004, so that's many years ago. And this concept, even though it was already accepted in the academia, it wasn't very popular. And for him, it was very significant because he looked at Western culture as part of, certainly until the 19th century, the major part of the Jewish culture, but not only. One of the things that's interesting to see is that when you think of the Bible as a focus of the development of Jewish culture, you certainly do understand that it's not only. It was also something that Western civilization and Western culture certainly developed in dialogue with. If you think about Shakespeare and his plays, and if you think about Rembrandt and his paintings, but even much earlier than that, the Old Testament is a source of inspiration, and not only religious. And he claims the same thing about Judaism, but it's more interesting for him is to retell some of the stories in the Bible, and I'll tell you just one of them. And the story is about the story of the Garden of Eden. And as you know, one day this woman was walking around in the garden, and she met a snake. And the snake says to her, "Why don't you eat from the tree of knowledge?" And Eve looks at the snake and says, "You know, God said that if you eat from the tree, you will die." And the snake says to her, "Nobody dies from education." And he ends up being right. And she looks at the tree and she says to herself, "Wow, this is really a beautiful tree." And but she also looks at the tree and she says, "You know, it's good to be educated. It's fun, and chmad laskil. It gives you a good feeling to be educated." And she actually takes from the fruit, realizing that she is going against God. And Yaakov says that this is a revolution. This is her revolt against God, who tried to create a humanity that has absolutely no morals, a humanity that cannot tell between good and bad. And that according to the Jewish story, it is because of the woman that we are able to tell, to differentiate between good and bad. So I think it's a worthwhile story to read in his eyes. And I'll just share with you two more ideas, and then we will open up to question. Secular Judaism, Faith, Values, and Spirituality. This book was not translated into Hebrew. And one of the interesting aspects that he deals with in this book is spirituality, is this concept of secularity and spirituality. So I certainly think it is a worthwhile read. And what is this little chick doing there? Well, a similar one was on my father's computer, and would sit there, and from time to time we would hear from the other room, tick, 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 knowing that this little chick was running around. He got this from one of his grandchildren, and he loved it. He had on his desk some really beautiful art, but he also had this little chick. So we're running a little short, so I will just describe something in this book. This is a book that has a preface written by Rabbi Sherwin Wine. Rabbi Wine and Yaakov met in 1990 when I was an emissary sent by the Jewish Agency to Detroit, Michigan. I happened to stumble upon the Birmingham Temple on Yom Kippur, got to know Rabbi Wine, and when Felice and Yaakov came to visit me, I think it was one of the first introductions that I did after Rabbi Wine asked me if I know about a speaker who was coming into town. And I said, yep, I know a good one. And Yaakov was always a sure bet. And he got involved with the movement many years before I did. And they became very, very good friends. By this time, I believe you have read what I wrote, what I quoted from the book. And Sherwin, in his way, really enjoyed their friendship. My father, in writing in the obituary after Sherwin died, said that he saw him as his brother. My father was an only child, and they were very much very close. They did not agree on everything, and they couldn't. You know Sherwin, and you know Yaakov. But they had a very strong friendship. And this concept of being able to articulate complicated concepts was something that Sherwin enjoyed Yaakov, the way Yaakov did it. And as you say, he ends by saying, if you want answers to these questions of this connection between practice and philosophy, you should actually read the book. And I found this picture from an article that came out in our first ordination in 2006. And as you see in the background, Sherwin and Yaakov are standing there, and the ordinees are next to them. Another good friend of theirs is Yehuda Bauer, who happily signed our certificates this year as well, and also sent us a blessing. Now, I want to tell you about this book, which connects to the to what I was saying before. I think one of the most important philosophical contributions that Yaakov did to our movement. He started off by, this is a small book which still exists. You can see it online. Basically, it started by saying, look, when we're looking at the reality today, this is from a lecture from 2002, we have two dangers. One danger comes from the secular, even though some religious people are part of that as well, and the other is the religious fanaticism, the postmodern relativism that doesn't want to accept these ideas of the idea that there is a universal validity of humanistic morality. He thinks is a great danger because we live in a relativistic society without a clear moral compass. The other danger is the religious fanaticism that relates what their own thoughts to the thoughts of God and creates some sort of a relationship between God's words and their thoughts, or really their thoughts attributing it to God. And therefore, if that is the authority, then there's nothing that you can actually do about that. So he says, wait a minute, let's stop for a minute and let's stop saying these words that there are the believers and they are the non-believers. The believers are the ones that believe in God, and all the rest are non-believers. And he asks the question, really, when we say religious, do we actually mean believers? And then he says that if we look at the etymology of the word in Hebrew for religious, which is dati, we clearly understand that the word for dat is law. It appears in many ancient writings, Persian ancient writings, such as Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, in the Bible, and it means the laws given by the king. And as you know, one of the names of God is the King of Kings. In other words, the laws given by the King of Kings to the people is what the people should actually do. So if once we said that our manual is the Torah, and eventually it became whatever the rabbis actually wrote, this is our manual of laws. In other words, the halakha. In other words, the dati. In other words, it doesn't have anything to do with belief. This whole concept of dat and data, you may think that it's not part of your world and your language anymore, but even the word data, this storable computer information, comes from the same etymology as dat, as religion. So it has nothing to do with belief in God. It has to do with abiding by the rules that you believe that God actually gave you. And if that is the truth, if that is that we are not talking anymore about the religious are the believers and the secular are the non-believers, let's ask a different question, and let us ask, what do secular Jews believe? If we talked about before about these two dangers, and one of this danger is the relativism, so what is he trying to say? What do Jews actually do believe? And then he suggests basically these three basic ideas. By the way, he has 13. And in that book, he has a whole sort of the mission statement of the secular humanistic people. And he starts from Hillel, the elderly, saying what is hateful to you, don't do to someone else. And then he refers to Kant, and he says, he says, treat humanity always as an end and never as a means only. And then the other thing that Kant says, there is no moral law that is not universally valid. In other words, you cannot believe in relativism if you believe in that. And I think this creates an interesting issue for us. You would say, wait a minute, we thought that we are pluralistic. And if we are pluralistic, then, everybody should live by their own beliefs. Well, I think that we are to a degree. In other words, I think we can add to our long definition of who we are another word. And really the word is that we are Jewish, secular, humanist, and pluralist. In other words, our pluralism is not relative. Our pluralism has a compass, and our compass is humanistic. And therefore, true, we may not be truly pluralistic because we have a moral compass, because we have a set of beliefs. And I think that this was something which was very, very important to Yaakov. And I think that where they met, Sherman and Yaakov, was the integrity. In other words, on the one hand, say what you believe, but also do as you say. If you believe that people should have a community center, should have a synagogue which is adapted to the new times, the new kind of society that is building in Israel, then that's the kind of community center that you should build. If you need to build a synagogue which has adapted to your culture, this is the kind of synagogue. If it happens to be in Detroit, or it happens to be in Chicago, or it happens to be in Israel. But this connection of articulating your beliefs, say what you believe, and do as you say, be true to the way you articulated your beliefs, is where they came together. So at this point, I will be opening to questions. Miriam?
I'm here. Sivan, thank you so much. I mean, there was so many things that I knew about Yaakov and so many new things that you taught us today. I'm really very grateful to you for being available to us and sharing your dad's story, and of course, part of your own. There's a few questions, but some people have asked a couple of things. One, would you make your PowerPoint available to us? And if so, just send me the link. What we'll do next week sometime is put together the recording, a link to the PowerPoint, and somebody asked about the books that you mentioned, and I wrote them all down. So I'll also put links to what the books were and where people can get the books. So you've got that. So Bruce Jaffe asked us, what did he think makes culture? What did Yaakov think makes culture? Art, music, drama, etc., etc. And then he wrote, ? Jewish culture. So I think he's looking for the difference between culture in general and Jewish culture.
Do you want to give me a few questions or one at a time?
I can do, yes. The other main question was Guy Regev and Rick Gold both asked about Professor Malkin's views. When do they become more aligned with Rabbi Wein's, and where did they differ? And you talked a little bit about that. And the other, Rick Gold wanted to know what the different approach to Zionism was between Sherwin and Yaakov. And if we have time, my question is about his rhetorical methodology. And I don't know whether you'll have time to do that. We can always do that when we're together in April. So just before Sivan answers these questions, I'll let all of you know that in April in Chicago, we are ordaining 2 new rabbis. And I know that Rabbi Maas will be with us, and it will be very exciting, and we'll get information about, it's going to be like a retreat, learning retreat, night and day together. So we'll get information out. So if anybody wants to come, they can come, and we will probably be live streaming. So if anybody wants to see, they'll be able to see. So I'll turn it to you, Sivan, to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you for those interesting and important and complicated questions. As you say, challenging. Okay, let's try. So certainly the definition of culture is all the creations of whatever people did. And then the question would be, which I understand it is, the follow-up question would be, what makes Jewish culture? According to Yaakov, I think it is probably the widest definition possible. In other words, people who created creations that made a difference in for the Jewish people. Some of them were Jews, maybe even most of them considered themselves Jewish, because for Yaakov, a Jewish person, like Chaim Cohen stated, Chaim Cohen was a Supreme Court judge and also was in Detroit at the time in one of the Federation conferences. Chaim Cohen said that if a person declares that they are Jewish, then in his eyes, and so should it be in the eyes of the Jewish state, he should be or she should be considered Jewish. So anyone Jewish who creates a creation which has an impact on Jewish life, that is Jewish culture. So if a Sutin, a Jewish artist, creates something, if Chagall creates something, but you can also, when it gets problematic, is when you try to define the lines, like to say, okay, Modigliani was Jewish, for example, but he really, as much as we know, talked about his Jewishness very rarely. He did, but rarely. Towards his death, he talked about his Jewishness more. So all of his creations, are they Jewish cultural creations? Can we call them that way? Some of these questions really are debatable. But what is important, I think, that Yaakov stated, was that every person is born into a culture. Maybe except, Mowgli, but every person is born into a culture, is born into a nation. And what he develops within his life connects culturally to that nation. Now, you can leave a nation, yes, but as long as you don't, things do develop culturally within. And I'll give you an example. He says, for example, if a French person talks about liberty, immediately the association goes to the French Revolution. If a Jewish person that has read Jewish writings and lives a ritual Jewish life, whatever form he has, he does know that when you talk about liberty and equality, then this resonates within the story, for example, of the Shabbat, okay? That on Shabbat, everybody should rest, okay? Everybody should be free from work. So these are things that connect culturally to your culture. And certainly things like language and heritage and traditions, and these are all part of the cultural of the ethnic national culture. As I said before, the borders are open, and there's a lot of dialogue here. And for example, when we do Passover, and we sing songs about liberty and justice, we have songs that are not Jewish, but have become part of our Jewish culture. I think there are things that are closer to the core that is easier to see them as Jewish. And then as further that you go out, you see that there's more and more dialogue with other cultures. And then this challenging question of is it or isn't it is worthwhile continuing the dialogue about. the questions on Zionism. One of the things, let's start with what they agreed on. What they did agree on is that Israel should exist, and there should be a Jewish homeland for those people who either need it or want it, or both. With that, I don't think, anyway, at the time of the discussions that I was part of, there was never a dispute about that. I don't think there was a dispute about things that should change in Israel, and politics that need to change with the focus on human rights. They were both strong advocates for that. I think when it differs is the narratives of the history of the State of Israel. And hopefully we will have a chance, and I will be able to tell you more about the different narratives, realizing again that Yaakov was here from 1934. Sherwin did come to visit quite a bit. And there's always a difference between the narrative of someone who is in the story and somebody looking out. I'm not saying that one is better or worse. I'm just saying that they're different. And I think that that's an interesting question, certainly to explore. I will share with you another short story. And this is a story that I will tell you the end of. I did share with you in the past. A few years before Yaakov died, his life was threatened by an ultra-Orthodox man. We didn't know at the time he was ultra-Orthodox, but he was. And he threatened his life. There was a knife that was stuck to the door, a letter, a threatening letter, and copies of that letter and another letter were put in the mailboxes of all the neighbors in our street. Some of them are religious, by the way. And there was a big, the police came, and it was in all the news broadcasts and all television, et cetera, and television and radio and printed media, all in all. But what came out of it was were two important things. One is that we were able to shift the discussion away from the predator to our cause, to talk about secular humanistic Judaism. And the picture that you see here are multitude of groups that came to talk to us, some religious, some secular, some both, who came to listen to Yaakov. And Yaakov loved it and had wonderful conversations with these people. So besides our meeting, our studying in their home, this is not their home, but it looked like that when we were studying in their home. And besides more and more groups coming to our garden, and this is another group, we also had visits from politicians. And this is the president of Israel, Herzog, sitting and discussing with Yaakov secular humanistic Judaism. So I think maybe for the first time in a long time, there is a president to the State of Israel who actually heard about us, knows about us, and we have to think in the future, what could that mean for us? And the tiny little story in the end, one thing you don't know about Yaakov. Yaakov started the first discotheque in Israel in the cellar of this synagogue cultural center that he built in Haifa. So this is a photograph from this discotheque in Israel, because Yaakov believed in having fun.
So there is one one other question, which I will write to you because it's profound and it'll take a lot to answer it.
Okay.
And I want to end on the fun because that goes to Yaakov's spirit. And besides his incredible intellect, his spirit of enjoying life and fun is something that will endure.
So this is a picture of Yaakov on Purim when we're celebrating Purim at home. I thought this should be an image to keep in your mind in Purim. We still have Tu B'Shvat in the middle, but Purim is coming along. So have a happy Purim. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you everyone for coming. Bye.